Orpheus and Eurydice, sleep story from Greek mythology. A note to listeners. This story is based on the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, drawn primarily from the versions preserved by the Roman poets Ovid and Virgil, our two richest surviving sources. The core elements: Orpheus's divine gift of music, Eurydice's death by snakebite, the descent into the underworld, the single unbreakable condition set by Hades, and the tragic backward glance, are all part of the genuine ancient tradition. Some dialogue and emotional interiority have been added to bring the tale to life for listening, in the spirit of storytelling that has surrounded this myth for over 2,000 years. As you listen tonight, you might find yourself asking the same question that has haunted this story since antiquity. Would you have looked back? Rest gently and let the ancient strings of Orpheus's lyre carry you toward sleep. Chapter 1. The song that moved the world. In the misted hills of Thrace, in a time when gods still walked close enough to mortals that the line between them blurred like morning fog on a river, there was born a child whose gift would become legend before he had even learned to walk. His name was Orpheus, and his mother was Calliope, muse of epic poetry, most eloquent of the 9 sisters who inspired all art and song among mortal men. Some said his father was a king of Thrace. Others whispered that it was Apollo himself, god of music and light, who had taken particular interest in the boy from his earliest days, and who one day placed into his small hands a lyre unlike any instrument mortal fingers had ever touched. Whatever the truth of his parentage, one fact was beyond dispute. No one, god or mortal, had ever made music the way Orpheus did. When he was still a boy, his mother would find him sitting alone beneath the olive trees, plucking at his lyre with an intensity that seemed far too old for his years, and the birds of the forest would gather in the branches above him, falling silent, as if even they understood they were hearing something they could never hope to match. As he grew older, the stories only became stranger and more wondrous. It was said that when Orpheus played, the rivers would slow their currents to listen. The wind would still itself. Even the ancient, silent stones of the mountainside were rumored to shift, ever so slightly, drawn toward the sound, as if his music tugged at something buried deep within their stony hearts. "You do not simply play music, my son," Calliope told him once, watching him practice by firelight, his fingers moving across the strings with an ease that seemed to belong to no ordinary craft. "You speak a language older than words. The trees understand you. The very earth understands you. Guard this gift carefully, for such power is rarely given without some corresponding price." Orpheus did not fully understand his mother's warning then. How could he, being still young, still drunk on the pure joy of creation, still discovering each day some new way to bend sound into something that could make grown warriors weep or shepherds forget, for a moment, the weight of their labor, he carried his gift with him across the known world, joining the great hero Jason, and his crew of Argonauts on their legendary voyage in search of the Golden Fleece, where his music proved more powerful than any sword. When the ship passed near the deadly sirens, whose songs had lured countless sailors to their deaths upon the rocks, it was Orpheus who saved the entire crew, not through wax in their ears or ropes binding them to the mast, as other heroes would later need, but simply by playing his own music louder and more beautiful than the siren's fatal call, so that his companions heard only his songs and sailed safely past the danger without ever knowing how close they had come to ruin. But it was after this great adventure, once he had returned home to the green hills of Thrace with his fame secured and his youth still bright upon him, that Orpheus encountered something his music alone could not have prepared him for. He fell in love. Her name was Eurydice, a nymph of the forests and rivers, a dryad by some accounts, or perhaps a naiad who dwelt among the flowing waters. The old stories disagree on this small detail, as they often do, but they agree entirely on one thing. She was radiant in a way that seemed to belong to the natural world itself, as though sunlight through leaves or the sparkle of water over stones had somehow gathered themselves into human form. Orpheus first saw her dancing along the riverbank with her sister nymphs, her dark hair loose and catching the afternoon light, her laughter rising above the sound of the water in a way that struck him, in that single unguarded moment, more powerfully than any music he had ever composed. He, who could move mountains and rivers with mere sound, found himself entirely without words, standing at the edge of that clearing, his lyre forgotten in his hands. "You stare as though you have never before seen a woman dance," Eurydice said, having noticed him long before he found his voice to speak, her eyes carrying a teasing warmth that immediately disarmed whatever careful courtly words he might have tried to assemble. "I have seen dancing before," Orpheus admitted, "but never dancing that made my own music feel suddenly inadequate. It was, perhaps, not the most polished thing a legendary musician might have said in such a moment, but it was entirely honest, and Eurydice, who had grown weary of the practiced flattery so many suitors offered her, found something genuinely disarming in his simple, stumbling truth. "Play for me," she said, "and let me judge for myself whether your music deserves such humility." Orpheus lifted his lyre and played, not the grand, world-moving compositions that had calmed storms and charmed monsters, but something smaller, more intimate, a melody that seemed to rise directly from whatever had stirred within his chest at the sight of her. And when he finished, Eurydice was quiet for a long moment, watching him with an expression that had shifted from teasing amusement into something far more thoughtful. That, she finally said, was not a song written for rivers or mountains or monsters. That was a song written for a single person standing in a single place at a single moment. "I do not think you have ever played such a song before." "I have not," Orpheus admitted. "I did not know such a song existed within me until this very afternoon." What followed was a courtship that the old poets describe with unusual tenderness, even for stories that so often dwell on the grand and the dramatic. Orpheus visited the riverbank each day, sometimes bringing new songs, sometimes simply sitting beside Eurydice in comfortable silence, learning the particular rhythms of her laughter, the small gestures she made when thinking deeply, the way she tilted her head when genuinely listening rather than merely waiting for her turn to speak. Your music has made kings weep and put dragons to sleep, Eurydice told him one evening as they sat together watching the sun set gold and pink across the water. And yet here you are, spending your afternoons with a simple river nymph instead of performing before crowds who would give anything to hear even a single note from your lyre. Crowds ask me to move them, Orpheus said. You are the first person who has ever simply wanted to know me. I find that I much prefer being known to being merely admired. They were married that same season, in a ceremony that the old stories describe as one of profound and simple joy. No grand political alliance, no careful courtly maneuvering, simply two people who had found in each other something neither had expected to find. Celebrating that discovery among friends, family, and the gentle blessing of the natural world that had first brought them together. Hymen himself, the god of marriage, was said to have attended their wedding, though even this seemingly auspicious presence carried, in hindsight, a troubling omen. For the torch he carried, which should have burned bright and clear as blessing upon the union, instead produced only thick, choking smoke that stung the eyes of the assembled guests, and refused, no matter how it was tended, to burn with proper flame. Pay it no mind, Orpheus said to his new bride, when she expressed quiet concern over this strange occurrence. Gods offer signs and omens constantly, and mortals spend far too much of their lives trying to interpret meanings that may not even be there. Today, I care only for this, that you are my wife, and I am your husband, and whatever the future holds, we shall face it together. Eurydice smiled at this, though something in her eyes suggested she was not entirely convinced by his easy dismissal of the smoking torch. You have moved mountains with your music, husband, she said, but even you cannot command the future to unfold exactly as we wish it. No, Orpheus agreed, drawing her close as the wedding feast continued around them. Music and laughter filling the warm evening air. But I can promise you this much. Whatever comes, I will not face it without trying everything within my power to protect what we have built together. It was a promise made in the innocent joy of a wedding day, spoken without any true understanding of how completely it would one day be tested, nor how the very love that made such a promise possible would also become the force that drove Orpheus toward a decision no mortal before him had ever dared attempt. A journey to the very edge of death itself, in pursuit of a love he could not bear to simply let go. Chapter 2. The Serpent in the Grass. The early days of their marriage passed with the particular golden quality that such happiness so often carries days that seemed to stretch longer than ordinary days, evenings that seemed to hold more warmth than evenings had any right to hold. The simple presence of each other's company, transforming even the most mundane tasks into something worth savoring. But the ancient poets tell us that beauty as radiant as Eurydice's rarely goes unnoticed, only by the man fortunate enough to have won her heart. Among those who had watched her with growing, unwelcome interest was a shepherd named Aristeus, himself said to be a son of Apollo, skilled in the arts of beekeeping and cultivation, a man of considerable talent in his own right, but possessed of a desire that, once fixed upon Eurydice, refused to accept the simple truth of her marriage to another. On a warm afternoon not long after the wedding, Eurydice walked alone through the meadows near the river, gathering flowers with her sister nymphs, as she had done countless times before her marriage, enjoying the particular freedom of movement that such simple pleasures allowed her even now as a wife. It was during this walk that Aristeus, having watched for an opportunity, approached her with intentions that immediately made clear he had no respect for the marriage bond that should have protected her from such pursuit. Eurydice, he called out, moving toward her with a determined stride that carried within it something far more troubling than simple, friendly greeting. I have watched you from a distance for too long. Come, walk with me, and let me tell you all the ways I might offer you a life even more beautiful than the one you currently know. I am married, Aristeus, Eurydice said, backing away, her voice carrying both firmness and the first note of genuine alarm at his aggressive approach. Whatever you believe you might offer, I have already found the life I wish to live. But Aristeus, undeterred by this clear rejection, continued to advance. And Eurydice, understanding suddenly the true danger of her situation, turned and ran through the meadow grass, deeper into the tangled undergrowth near the riverbank. Her sister nymphs scattering in alarm as their pursuers' intentions became unmistakably clear. It was in this desperate flight, running through grass she could not fully see beneath her hurried feet, that Eurydice's foot came down upon something coiled and hidden among the vegetation. A viper, startled from its resting place, striking instinctively at the ankle that had disturbed it. The pain was immediate and terrible, and Eurydice fell to the ground even as Aristeus, seeing what had happened, stopped his pursuit entirely, backing away in sudden horror at the consequence his own actions had inadvertently caused. Her sister nymphs rushed to her side, but there was little any of them, mortal or divine as they might have been, could do against the swift and merciless poison already spreading through her blood. She died there, in the meadow grass beneath the afternoon sun, her sister nymphs weeping around her. The beauty and joy that had marked her brief, happy marriage cut short with a suddenness that seemed almost cruelly disproportionate to whatever small step, whatever moment of misplaced foot had brought about such an ending. Orpheus, when word finally reached him of what had happened, could not at first comprehend the news being delivered to him. He had left Eurydice that very morning in perfect health, her laughter still echoing in his memory as he had departed for a brief errand in a nearby village. How could the world have shifted so completely, so irreversibly, in the span of a single afternoon? She is gone, he repeated to the messenger who had brought this devastating news, as though saying the words aloud might somehow reveal them to be some terrible misunderstanding rather than simple, immovable fact. You are certain. There is no possibility of error. I am certain, my lord, the messenger said, his own eyes red with the shared grief of a community that had loved Eurydice for her gentle warmth. Her sisters carried her back themselves. The physicians could do nothing. The poison worked too swiftly for any remedy to be attempted. What followed, according to every ancient account of this tragedy, was a grief so profound, so all-consuming, that it seemed to transform Orpheus entirely, stripping away, in a single devastating blow, the joyful, confident young man who had won Eurydice's heart through simple, honest music, replacing him with something closer to a hollow vessel, moving through the motions of continued existence without any true sense of purpose or direction remaining within him. He composed no music during those first terrible days. His lyre, the instrument that had once seemed almost an extension of his own body, lay untouched and silent, as though even it understood that whatever songs might emerge from such devastating grief could offer no true comfort, no meaningful expression adequate to what had been lost. I do not understand, Orpheus said to his mother Calliope, who had come to sit with her grieving son in the days following the funeral rites performed for Eurydice. I have spent my entire life believing that music holds power beyond ordinary mortal capability. I have calmed storms. I have charmed monsters. I have moved stones and rivers with mere sound. And yet, in this moment, when I need that power more desperately than I have ever needed anything, I find myself utterly powerless. Grief is not something music alone can conquer, my son, Calliope said gently, though even she seemed uncertain how to comfort a sorrow so complete. Not even the gods themselves possess power over death's finality. This is the one boundary that even divine gifts cannot fully cross. But even as his mother spoke these words, meant as gentle acceptance of an unchangeable truth, something else was already beginning to stir within Orpheus's grieving mind. A thought so audacious, so unprecedented, that he almost feared to give it full conscious shape, lest simply thinking it too clearly might reveal its obvious impossibility. You say even the gods cannot cross death's boundary, Orpheus said slowly, turning this idea over with the same careful attention he might once have given to composing a new and difficult piece of music. And yet the boundary itself exists as a place, does it not? A realm ruled by Hades, accessible, according to every story I have ever heard, to certain heroes who found their way there and returned again. Heracles, Theseus, even Orpheus's own distant kinsman Odysseus is said to have visited its shadowy edges without fully dying himself. Those were heroes on divine quests, sanctioned by the gods themselves, Calliope said, understanding with growing alarm where her son's thoughts were leading him. You speak now of something entirely different, not a brief visit to gather prophecy or information, but an attempt to reverse death itself, to bring back a soul who has already crossed fully into that realm. I speak of trying, Orpheus said, and for the first time since receiving news of Eurydice's death, something like purpose flickered back into his hollow eyes. I have a gift unlike any other mortal has possessed. If any living being might possibly move Hades himself to mercy, might possibly find some path through that realm that other mortals have never successfully navigated, would it not be someone whose very music has already proven capable of moving stones and rivers and storms? Orpheus, his mother said, her voice carrying genuine fear now. No mortal has ever successfully retrieved a soul already claimed by death. The realm of Hades does not release what it has taken. This is not simply difficult. It may well be entirely impossible, and the attempt itself carries dangers I cannot begin to fully warn you against. Then I shall be the first, Orpheus said, and in his voice, his mother heard something that mixed genuine determination with an edge of something closer to desperation. The particular quality of a man who has already decided that a life without attempting the impossible holds less value to him than whatever risk the attempt itself might carry. I cannot simply accept that she is gone, mother, he continued, his voice breaking slightly despite his evident determination. I cannot return to composing songs for kings and crowds, cannot resume some ordinary continuation of life, while knowing that Eurydice exists somewhere still, however transformed by death, however distant that existence might now be from the woman I loved. I must at least try, whatever the cost, whatever the danger. I must try to bring her back, or else spend whatever remains of my own life knowing I surrendered to grief without ever testing whether my gift might have accomplished something no other mortal had managed. And so, gathering his lyre, the instrument he had left untouched through days of devastating mourning, Orpheus began preparing for a journey that no living mortal had ever successfully completed in quite the way he now intended. A deliberate descent into the very realm of death itself, carrying with him nothing but music, love, and a desperate hope that even Hades, Lord of the Dead, might somehow be moved to grant an exception to the most fundamental law governing mortal existence. Chapter 3: The Descent. The entrance to the Underworld, according to the old stories, lay in various locations across the ancient world. Caves and chasms said to lead down into that shadowed realm, where all mortal souls eventually found their final resting place. Orpheus, guided by instructions his mother reluctantly provided, along with whatever divine assistance Apollo himself might have quietly offered his gifted son, made his way to one such entrance, a dark cave mouth that seemed to exhale a cold, stale breath entirely, unlike the warm Thracian air surrounding it. He paused at that threshold for a long moment, his lyre held ready in his hands, understanding with complete clarity that whatever lay beyond this entrance represented territory no living mortal fully understood, populated by beings and dangers that even the greatest heroes of legend approached with considerable caution and careful preparation. Whatever waits within, Orpheus said quietly to himself, more as a means of steadying his own resolve than as genuine address to any listening presence. I carry with me the one gift that has never yet failed to move even the most resistant heart. If music can calm the fury of the sea, surely it can move even death's own guardians to mercy. He stepped into the darkness, and the world of ordinary sunlight and warmth fell away behind him, replaced by a cold, twilight realm that seemed to stretch in every direction without clear boundary or familiar landmark. The path, such as it was, led him downward through passages that seemed carved from living shadow itself, until eventually he arrived at the banks of a wide, dark river, the Styx, or perhaps the Acheron. The ancient accounts differ on precisely which of the underworlds several rivers he first encountered, where a hunched, ancient figure waited beside a weathered boat, ready to ferry the newly dead across to whatever judgment awaited them on the far shore. This was Charon, the ferryman, whose task it was to carry only the souls of the properly dead across these waters, and whose stern refusal to transport any living mortal had turned back countless would-be heroes before Orpheus ever arrived at that dark riverbank. You do not belong here, Charon said, his voice carrying the particular flat indifference of a being who had witnessed countless such attempted intrusions over the uncounted centuries of his eternal duty. This vessel carries only the dead across these waters. Turn back now, mortal, before you discover exactly how unwelcome the living truly are within this realm. But Orpheus, rather than arguing or pleading, simply lifted his lyre and began to play a melody that spoke, without need of accompanying words, of love lost too suddenly, of grief too vast for ordinary mortal endurance, of a devotion so complete that it had driven him to attempt what no living being had successfully attempted before. Charon, who had ferried countless thousands of souls across these dark waters throughout his endless existence, who had grown entirely accustomed to grief and loss as the routine currency of his eternal occupation, found himself nonetheless deeply moved by what he heard in Orpheus's playing, something that transcended the ordinary sorrow he witnessed daily, carrying within it a purity of devotion that even his ancient, weathered heart could not entirely resist. Without further protest, Charon guided his boat toward the shore where Orpheus stood, allowing him to step aboard for a crossing that living mortals were simply never meant to make. On the far shore, further trials awaited. Cerberus, the massive three-headed hound who guarded the Underworld's final gate, prowled restlessly before that entrance, his multiple heads growling low warning to any who might attempt unauthorized passage. This was the guardian whose ferocity had turned back or destroyed countless souls and heroes alike throughout the ages. A beast whose loyalty to his master Hades manifested in absolute, unwavering vigilance against any who might threaten the realm's careful boundaries. Orpheus, approaching this fearsome guardian with considerably more trepidation than he had shown Charon, nonetheless lifted his lyre once more, playing now a gentler melody, something closer to lullaby than lament, a song designed not to move through grief, but to soothe and calm even the most vigilant of watchful spirits. Slowly, one by one, Cerberus's 3 heads began to droop, his growling subsiding into something closer to contented sighing, until finally the massive hound settled onto the ground entirely, overcome by a peaceful drowsiness that Orpheus's music had gently woven around him, allowing the musician to step past the sleeping guardian and proceed deeper into the underworld's shadowed halls. He walked among the countless dead, shades and spirits who paused in their eternal, quiet wandering to watch this strange, living presence move through their midst, drawn by the same music that had already charmed Charon and Cerberus, following him at a curious distance as he made his way toward the throne room where Hades and Persephone, king and queen of this entire dark realm, held eternal court over all who had passed beyond mortal life. When Orpheus finally stood before their thrones, he found himself facing beings whose combined authority represented the very finality of death itself. Hades, stern and unwavering, ruler of a realm from which no soul had ever been permanently released, and beside him Persephone, whose own complicated history of being taken to this realm against her will perhaps lent her a particular capacity for understanding loss and longing that her husband, in his eternal role as death's unbending administrator, might otherwise have lacked. Mortal, Hades said, his voice carrying the particular weight of absolute authority long unchallenged by anyone bold or foolish enough to attempt such challenge. You stand now before thrones that few living beings have ever approached. State your purpose, that we might determine whether your presence here represents mere trespass or something worthy of our attention. Orpheus, rather than immediately offering spoken explanation, instead lifted his lyre one final time and began to play and sing a song unlike any he had composed before, one that told, in melody and verse together, the complete story of his love for Eurydice, from their first meeting beside the river to their joyful wedding, through the sudden, devastating loss that had brought him to this impossible, unprecedented journey. He sang of grief so complete that ordinary existence had become nearly unbearable. He sang of love so profound that even death's absolute boundary had failed to convince him to simply accept permanent separation. He sang, finally, of his desperate hope, however presumptuous, however unprecedented, that even Hades and Persephone, rulers of death itself, might find within their own hearts some capacity for the mercy he now so desperately sought. The effect of this song upon the assembled realm proved unlike anything the underworld had witnessed in all its long, eternal existence. The countless shades who had gathered to watch found themselves weeping, spirits who had long since transcended such mortal emotional responses, moved once again to tears by the sheer beauty and sincerity of what they heard. Even the terrible Furies, those ancient goddesses of vengeance, whose faces had never before shown anything but implacable severity, found their own cheeks wet with unexpected tears, moved despite themselves by devotion so pure and complete. And Hades himself, along with Persephone beside him, found their own stern resolve softening beneath the weight of such extraordinary, unprecedented musical petition. "No mortal has ever moved me as you have moved me this day," Hades said finally, when Orpheus's song had reached its conclusion, his voice carrying something that, for the first time in the entire encounter, suggested genuine consideration rather than simple, absolute authority. "Your grief is real. Your devotion is beyond question. I find myself, against every precedent this realm has ever established, inclined toward granting you what you seek." Persephone, beside her husband, nodded her own agreement. "Eurydice's soul may return with you to the world of the living," she confirmed. "But such an unprecedented exception cannot be granted without equally unprecedented conditions attached." Orpheus, scarcely daring to believe what he was hearing, listened with complete, desperate attention as Hades outlined the single, absolute condition upon which this extraordinary mercy depended. "You shall lead the way back to the world above," Hades said, his voice carrying renewed weight and authority as he pronounced this crucial stipulation. "Eurydice shall follow behind you, her presence bound to your own forward progress through these shadowed halls and passages. But hear this clearly, Orpheus, for I shall not repeat it, nor shall any plea for clarification or exception be granted once you have departed this throne room. You must not look back to confirm her presence. Not once, not for any reason, not until you have both fully emerged into the light of the world above. Should you turn to look upon her even a moment too soon, while either of you yet remains within my realm's shadowed boundaries, she shall be lost to you again, this time permanently, with no possibility of any further appeal or exception." "I understand," Orpheus said, though even as he spoke these words, some small part of him, some quiet, honest corner of his own heart, wondered whether he truly did understand the full weight of what he was agreeing to, or whether the desperate joy of this unprecedented second chance had temporarily overwhelmed his capacity to fully grasp just how difficult such absolute, unwavering trust might prove to maintain across the long, dark journey that still awaited him. "Then go," Hades said, "and may whatever devotion drove you to attempt this impossible task prove strong enough to see it through to its proper completion." And so Orpheus turned from the throne room, beginning the long ascent back toward the world of light and life, trusting, though he could not yet know how severely that trust would be tested, that somewhere behind him, in the shadowed darkness, he dared not turn to confirm. Eurydice's spirit followed faithfully in his footsteps, drawn by whatever force had once drawn her to his music beside that long-ago riverbank, now drawing her once more toward the promise of restored life and continued love. Chapter 4. The Ascent. Would you look back? The passage upward through the underworld's shadowed halls felt, to Orpheus, entirely different from his earlier descent, where his journey down had been driven by clear, urgent purpose. Reach Hades, plead his case, secure whatever mercy might be possible. This return journey carried instead a different, more excruciating quality: the absolute necessity of trust without confirmation, of faith maintained across long minutes, and then hours without any sensory evidence that his faith was justified. He could not hear footsteps behind him. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire arrangement, though whether by simple nature of how shades moved through their own realm, or through some deliberate additional test embedded within Hades's condition, Orpheus found that no sound of following presence reached his ears as he climbed steadily upward through the dark, winding passages. She is there, he told himself, as the silent darkness stretched onward, passage after passage, each one seeming to test his resolve more severely than the last. Hades gave his word. Whatever else might be said of the Lord of the Dead, he is not known throughout any tradition as a being who breaks solemn promises made before his own throne, witnessed by his own queen and by countless assembled souls. But even as he told himself this, walking steadily forward through darkness, he dared not turn to examine more carefully. Another voice, quieter, more insidious, born perhaps from the same desperate love that had driven him to attempt this impossible rescue in the first place, began to whisper different, more troubling possibilities. What if this entire arrangement was never truly meant to succeed? This quieter voice suggested, growing steadily more persistent as the silent ascent continued. What if Hades, moved by your song in the moment, granted this concession more to be rid of your desperate pleading than from any genuine intention to actually release a soul his realm had already properly claimed? What if the condition itself, impossible to verify, impossible to confirm, was designed from its very inception to ensure eventual failure, allowing Hades to maintain the appearance of mercy while ensuring that his realm's fundamental law, that death remains permanent and absolute, ultimately remains unbroken? Was this fair suspicion? Or was it simply the natural product of grief and desperate hope curdling, under sustained pressure, into paranoid doubt? The old stories themselves seem uncertain on this point, offering us a hero whose motivations remain genuinely ambiguous even after 2,000 years of retelling and interpretation. Consider, dear listener, what you yourself might have felt climbing through that same absolute darkness, unable to hear any confirming sound of footsteps, carrying the entire weight of your beloved's restored existence upon nothing but the word of a god whose realm you had just violated through unprecedented trespass. Would doubt not creep in, however much your rational mind insisted upon maintaining faith? Would the silence itself not become, with each passing moment, increasingly unbearable? Was Orpheus simply impatient? A man whose extraordinary musical gift had perhaps accustomed him throughout his entire life to seeing immediate results from his efforts, unprepared for the particular patience that absolute, unconfirmed trust demanded? Or did he genuinely believe, based on reasonable suspicion, that the gods were deceiving him? That this entire arrangement represented some subtle divine test or trick rather than authentic mercy? And that his eventual backward glance represented not weakness, but rather a desperate attempt to confirm a truth he suspected was being deliberately concealed from him? Or perhaps, and this explanation carries its own particular tragic weight, Orpheus simply could not bear the crushing uncertainty of not knowing whether Eurydice truly followed him at all. Perhaps it was not doubt of the god's honesty that drove him, but rather overwhelming fear that some accident, some misstep in that shadowed realm might have separated them without his knowledge, leaving him to complete this entire arduous journey only to emerge alone into sunlight, having believed himself accompanied by his beloved wife, when in truth he walked entirely by himself. The ancient poet Ovid, in his own retelling of this myth, suggests something perhaps even more universally resonant than simple impatience or suspicion: that this entire story ultimately concerns something deeper than any single explainable motivation, touching instead upon the fundamental nature of grief itself and humanity's profound, perhaps impossible struggle to truly release what we have lost, to trust fully in processes and outcomes we cannot directly witness or confirm with our own senses. For is this not, in some sense, the very nature of grief itself? We are asked, in the aftermath of profound loss, to trust that healing follows its own proper course, that time itself performs some necessary work we cannot directly observe or measure, that patience and faith, maintained across long stretches of painful uncertainty, will eventually deliver us to some restored state of peace or resolution. And yet how difficult, how nearly impossible such sustained trust often proves to be, when every fiber of our being desperately wants immediate confirmation that our suffering has not been in vain, that what we have lost is indeed being properly restored to us. Orpheus, climbing through that final stretch of darkness, drew steadily closer to the boundary between the underworld and the world of ordinary sunlight and life. He could see, ahead of him now, the first faint suggestion of natural light beginning to filter down through the passage's uppermost reaches, proof, at last, that his long journey was nearing its successful conclusion, that mere moments remained before he would step fully into that light, which point, according to Hades's own careful stipulation, he would finally be permitted to turn and confirm what he had trusted through this entire agonizing ascent. But it was in this final stretch, so close to complete success, that the accumulated weight of doubt, fear, and desperate uncertainty finally overcame Orpheus's careful resolve. Some ancient accounts suggest he heard, or believed he heard, some small sound behind him. Perhaps Eurydice herself, stumbling slightly on the uneven passage floor. Perhaps simply the echo of his own footsteps distorted by the passage's particular acoustics. Impossible now to determine with any certainty. Other versions suggest no such sound occurred at all, that Orpheus's turn came from pure, unbearable psychological pressure alone. The simple human inability to maintain absolute faith across such an extended period of complete sensory deprivation regarding his beloved's presence. Whatever the precise trigger, in that final crucial moment, with sunlight already visible ahead of him, with success so tantalizingly close that mere steps remained before the conditions requirement would have been naturally, easily fulfilled, Orpheus turned his head to look back, and there, in the shadowed threshold between death's realm and the world of living light, he saw her, Eurydice, following faithfully just as Hades had promised, her form still carrying the particular pale translucence of the newly dead, not yet fully restored to solid mortal flesh, a transformation that would only have completed itself once she too had stepped fully into sunlight. For one impossibly brief, precious moment, their eyes met. Orpheus, Eurydice said, and in her voice, the ancient poets tell us, there was no anger, no accusation, only a profound, aching sorrow that carried within it something close to acceptance, as though some part of her had perhaps anticipated exactly this outcome, had understood better than her husband himself the impossible weight of the trust being demanded of him. What have you done? Even as she spoke these final words, Orpheus watched in absolute, helpless horror as she began to fade, drawn backward by some irresistible force back into the shadowed darkness from which they had both, mere moments before, seemed on the very verge of successfully escaping together. No, Orpheus cried out, lunging forward in a desperate attempt to catch hold of her before she vanished entirely. But his reaching hands closed on nothing but empty, insubstantial air, Eurydice already dissolving back into shadow, her form growing more transparent with each passing heartbeat, until finally, with one last whispered word that some accounts suggest was simply his name, spoken not in anger, but in profound, sorrowful farewell, she disappeared entirely, pulled back into death's realm, this time, as Hades had warned, with absolute and irreversible finality. Orpheus stood frozen at that threshold, sunlight streaming down around him from the world above, while behind him lay only darkness and silence where, moments before, his beloved wife's presence had briefly, impossibly, been restored to him. he attempted, according to several ancient accounts, to follow her back down into the underworld immediately, desperate to somehow plead his case once more, to beg for whatever second chance might possibly still remain available to him. But Karen, this time, refused entirely to ferry him back across the Styx's dark waters. Understanding perhaps better than Orpheus himself in that moment of devastated grief that some boundaries, once crossed and then violated, simply cannot be crossed again through mere repeated pleading, however sincere or desperate that pleading might prove to be. Would you, dear listener, have maintained that same absolute trust, climbing through such complete darkness, unable to confirm through any of your senses that your beloved truly followed behind you? Or would doubt, however carefully reasoned or however purely emotional, have eventually overcome your own resolve as well, in that same final, crucial moment when success seemed so impossibly close at hand? Perhaps there is no single correct answer to such a question. Perhaps this very uncertainty, this genuine difficulty in confidently predicting our own behavior under such extraordinary and unprecedented pressure, represents precisely why this ancient story has continued resonating with listeners across more than 2,000 years of retelling. Each new audience finding within Orpheus's tragic, understandable failure some reflection of their own struggles with trust, with grief, with the profound difficulty of releasing our need for immediate confirmation in favor of patient, sustained faith. Chapter 5. The Silence After. Orpheus emerged from the underworld's entrance alone, stepping into sunlight that should have represented triumphant success, but instead illuminated only the hollow devastation of a man who had come so impossibly close to restoring everything he had lost, only to watch that restoration slip away through his own inability to maintain trust across those final, crucial moments. The ancient poets tell us that for 7 days and nights, following this second, final loss, Orpheus remained beside the cave entrance through which he had descended, neither eating nor sleeping, simply sitting in stunned, grief-stricken silence, as though some part of him still hoped that further waiting, further demonstrated patience, might yet somehow reverse what his earlier impatience had undone. But death's boundary, once properly and finally sealed, offered no further exceptions. However long or however sincerely Orpheus might continue his desperate vigil beside that dark threshold, eventually he rose and returned to the world of the living, though those who encountered him in the months and years that followed described someone who seemed to exist only partially within that world, as though the essential core of who he had once been remained, forever trapped in that final glimpse of Eurydice dissolving back into darkness. He composed music still, for this gift remained his even through such profound devastation. But the songs he now created carried a different quality than his earlier compositions, no longer simply beautiful or moving, but touched now with a particular depth of sorrow that seemed to emerge from genuine, lived understanding of loss's most absolute finality. Numerous women, moved by both his continued extraordinary talent and by sympathy for his evident, profound grief, attempted over the following years to offer him companionship, hoping perhaps to help him rediscover some capacity for renewed happiness. But Orpheus, according to every ancient account, refused every such approach, remaining entirely devoted to Eurydice's memory in a manner that some interpretations suggest bordered on unhealthy obsession, while others frame instead as simply the natural, if extreme, expression of a love too profound and too completely tested to ever be transferred toward any other object of affection. I have already loved once with everything I possess, he reportedly told one such would-be companion who approached him during these later years. I gave that love its fullest possible expression, followed it even into death's own realm, and lost it there through my own failure to maintain sufficient trust. I do not believe I possess sufficient remaining capacity to offer any comparable devotion to another, nor would it feel honest to attempt such a pretense, however much I might value simple companionship in my continued solitude. This persistent, unwavering devotion to Eurydice's memory, while understandable given the extraordinary circumstances of their loss, eventually brought Orpheus into conflict with followers of Dionysus, god of wine and ecstatic revelry, whose female devotees, known as Maenads, had grown increasingly frustrated by Orpheus's continued rejection of all romantic advances, interpreting his devotion to a dead wife as troubling rejection of life's continuing pleasures and possibilities. The specific circumstances leading to what followed vary somewhat across different ancient accounts, but the essential tragic outcome remains consistent throughout. During one of their ecstatic revels, the Maenads, whether through accumulated resentment at his persistent rejections, or through some more immediate provocation lost to historical memory, turned upon Orpheus with sudden, violent fury, tearing him apart in their frenzied state, scattering his remains across the countryside in an act of destruction as sudden and devastating as the original loss of Eurydice had been. Yet even this violent ending carries within it one final, strange, and beautiful detail that the ancient poets particularly loved to recount. Orpheus's severed head, carried by the river's current down toward the sea, continued singing even after death had claimed the rest of his physical form. His voice, that extraordinary gift which had charmed monsters and moved the very stones of mountains, persisting in mournful song even beyond the boundary of his own mortal life, as though love and grief, so profound as it simply could not be entirely silenced even by death itself. This singing head eventually washed ashore on the island of Lesbos, where it was said to have continued its mournful music, inspiring the island's later reputation as a place of particular poetic and musical inspiration. as though Orpheus's final gift to the world was this lasting legacy of song born directly from love and loss, too profound for even death to fully silence. And what of Orpheus's own soul, finally freed by this violent death from whatever continued earthly suffering his grief had inflicted upon him? The kinder versions of this myth suggest that in death, Orpheus finally found what his living journey had failed to secure: reunion with Eurydice within the Underworld's shadowed halls, where the two of them, no longer bound by any cruel condition regarding forward glances or trusted footsteps, could finally walk together freely, side by side, rather than one trailing carefully behind the other. Their love finally restored in the one realm where such restoration required no further impossible test of patient, unconfirmed faith. So what, in the end, does this ancient story truly ask of us? Perhaps it is not, ultimately, a simple morality tale about the dangers of impatience, though impatience certainly played its role in Orpheus's tragic failure. Perhaps it is not simply a caution against doubting divine promises, though such doubt clearly contributed to his fatal decision as well. Perhaps it is not even, in its deepest sense, merely a story about fear that a beloved presence might not truly be following as promised. Though this fear, too, seems genuinely present within the myth's careful details. Perhaps, instead, this story exists to illuminate something more universal and more difficult than any single, simple explanation can fully capture: the profound, nearly impossible challenge that grief presents to every person who has ever loved deeply and lost completely. The challenge of trusting a process we cannot directly observe, of maintaining faith across periods of complete uncertainty, of resisting the desperate, entirely human urge to seek immediate confirmation, rather than patiently allowing necessary time and distance to complete their proper, unhurried work. We are asked, in the aftermath of profound loss, to walk forward without constantly looking back, trusting that what we have lost is being properly processed, properly integrated into our ongoing existence, even though we cannot directly witness or confirm this healing as it occurs. And like Orpheus, so many of us find this sustained trust nearly impossible to maintain completely, turning back again and again to examine our grief, to confirm its presence, to ensure we have not somehow lost even the memory and meaning of what we once possessed. Turns that, paradoxically, sometimes threaten to undo the very healing we so desperately seek. So we return, finally, dear listener, to the question this story has posed throughout. Would you have looked back? Would you have maintained that impossible trust through complete darkness and silence? Or would your own doubt, your own fear, your own simple human need for confirmation have eventually overcome your resolve in that same crucial, final moment? Perhaps there is no shame in admitting that you too might have turned. Perhaps this is precisely why Orpheus's story has endured for so many centuries. Not because it offers us a hero whose perfect faith we should strive to emulate, but because it offers us instead a deeply human figure whose very human failure reminds us that trust, patience, and the ability to release our need for immediate confirmation represent genuinely difficult achievements, not simple, easily accomplished virtues. Rest now, dear listener, and as you drift toward your own peaceful sleep tonight, consider gently this ancient question, without judgment toward whatever answer feels true to your own heart. In that same impossible darkness, carrying that same desperate love and desperate uncertainty, would you have looked back? Whatever your answer, know that the very fact of asking the question, of sitting honestly with its difficulty, connects you to countless generations of listeners who have pondered this same impossible choice across more than 2,000 years of storytelling. A testament to how deeply this ancient tale continues to speak to something genuinely universal within the human heart. Sleep well, and may whatever you carry forward from today find its own gentle, patient peace, without need for constant backward glances to confirm what time and trust are quietly, faithfully working to heal. The end